Princeton N. Lyman is an adjunct senior fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former U.S. ambassador to South Africa and Nigeria. He also is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. His career in government included assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa from 1981 to 1986, U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria from 1986 through 1989, Director of Refugee Programs, Ambassador to South Africa, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, and as Director of the United States Agency for International Development in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia from 1976 to 1978. He's published op-eds in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Baltimore Sun, Miami Herald, Los Angeles Times, and International Herald Tribune. His publications include the article Obama and Africa, Matching Expectations with Reality, which was published in the Columbia Journal of International Affairs. He co-edited Beyond Humanitarianism, What You Need to Know About Africa and Why It Matters through the Council on Foreign Relations. A CFR report, More Than Humanitarianism, A Strategic U.S. Approach Toward Africa from 2006. And he is the author of Partner to History, The U.S. Role in South Africa's Transition to Democracy, published by the U.S. Institute of Peace Press. He received a PhD from Harvard University in political science. This event, as I mentioned, is co-sponsored by the Utah Council on Citizen Diplomacy and the American Academy of Diplomacy. For those of you who are not familiar with the UCCD here in Utah, we're very fortunate in our community to have the Utah Council. If you take a quick visit to their website, and you can find it very easily at utahdiplomacy.org, you will find hundreds and even thousands of visitors that have come to Utah, professionals, educators, teachers, parliamentarians who've had an opportunity to experience the beauty that we enjoy every day, get to know the people of Utah, and to learn from us as we learn from them. At the Kennedy Center, we follow very closely the work of the UCCD. We're very appreciative of their work, and also this singular opportunity to host Dr. Lyman. Again, the topic for today's presentation, rebuilding diplomatic capacity. Why should we do it? What will it cost? Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Princeton Lyman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leonard. I appreciate that, and appreciate you all being here, and thank you to the Utah Council on Citizen Diplomacy, to Laura Dupuy, the Executive Director, to Jennifer Hefty, who did so much to make it possible for me to figure out how to get here and back and make all the arrangements, and to the Kennedy Center here. You know, when we talk about rebuilding diplomatic capacity, and we hear a lot about it in this administration, taking a more diplomatic approach to things, et cetera. And one of the things I'd like to start out is to ask you, what does that mean when we say taking a diplomatic approach? What is it that diplomats do? What are they about? The image is, of course, that they go and talk to people, and they do. But a diplomatic approach is something much bigger and much broader than that. It has several elements to it. First and foremost is that a diplomatic approach means that you're conveying to your partners or to potential adversaries or others the nature of American interests and the nature of American resources that are behind that, and the reasons, in most cases, that you think that cooperation or alignment with the U.S. position is good for all parties. Now that means doing several things. That means listening an awful lot. It means listening to what is going on in other countries, why they think the way they do, why they take positions the way they do, what their interests are, and that you understand that. But in this world, one of the things we realize is we have to listen to more than what the government is saying or what the press is saying, but what a lot of people are saying, what religious groups are saying, what non-governmental people are saying. And that takes a capacity and an outreach ability that has suffered a great deal since the 1990s, and which now we have to rebuild. Now, when you talk about a diplomatic approach, you don't just talk about State Department people going and talking about what the State Department has to say. Because when you're dealing in a diplomatic environment and you are negotiating or you're urging people to take particular positions, you really want to bring to bear all the resources of the United States and all its interests. It means knowing what our interests are with USTR, our trade representative, and what our military interests are, and what our aid programs are doing or not doing or might be able to do, and being able to bring all that information together. Let me give you some examples. When you're dealing with Nigeria, which I had the privilege of being ambassador there, and I still stay very close to Nigerian events, there are several American interests that are going on at the same time. It's the biggest, most populous country in Africa, 150 million people perhaps. It plays a big role in regional peacekeeping. It's the 5th largest supplier of oil to the United States. There are a lot of American investments there, particularly in the oil industry. It's also got one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, larger than Egypt's. And therefore what's happening in the Muslim population, what's going on there is obviously of importance. All those interests have to come to bear when you're addressing U.S. interests in Nigeria, and you have to be conscious of all of them, and you have to know how to balance them and use them to advance what are U.S. interests, and you have to know what they are. I'll give you another example. In South Africa, I had the privilege of being there during the transition from apartheid to the government of Nelson Mandela, a very exciting, but also a very tricky period. Those negotiations went on for 4 years. There were times that they looked like they were going to collapse. We didn't really know if they would come off peacefully, etc. And the question is, what's the role of the U.S.? Well, the South Africans said, we don't want mediators. This is our country. We're going to do this, which was the right way to go. But we surrounded that process with all the help the United States was able to give, because a collapse of those negotiations and civil war in South Africa would have been disastrous. That meant our aid programs, our then USIA programs, and bringing out our people from the Pentagon to talk to their military, to talk to the people ex-military who were thinking fomenting a coup, about the implications of that, of bringing to bear our intelligence. Yes, we had to use our intelligence resources because we discovered just on the eve of that election for Nelson Mandela that South Africa had carried out, in spite of what it said to the contrary, its chemical and biological warfare program. It was still going on. And we had to deal with that, and we had to bring in our intelligence resources. We had to talk to the Pentagon. We had to talk to the CIA. We had to deal with the British, who were also on the same problem area. We had to deal with the government, etc. So diplomacy is bringing all your different resources to bear, but hopefully coming out with an agreement that doesn't end up in violence, doesn't end up, of course, in the worst case, where the U.S. military has to be involved. And where the U.S. military is involved, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, like places like Iraq and Afghanistan, it's again bringing the resources of the civilian agencies to bear to make those interventions successful. There are also exciting things you do in diplomacy, rewarding things. And I'll tell you one of the most rewarding that I had the privilege of doing as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, and it shows that America sometimes acts in ways of great humanitarian need. In 1984, for complicated reasons, a period of great drought in Ethiopia and oppressive military government, 9,000 Ethiopian Jews snuck across the border into Sudan to get away from Ethiopia and hopefully to get help in Sudan. But in Sudan, they hid. They hid because Sudan was an Islamic country. Other Ethiopian refugees were not friendly toward Ethiopian Jews. And while they were hiding in southern Sudan, they began to die. They weren't getting food aid. They were hiding their dead. And when we discovered all this, and the Israelis came to us and said, look, you've got to help us, we put together an extraordinary rescue plan, coordinated out of the State Department, that enabled, in operation over weeks, to move 9,000 people secretly through, but with the knowledge of the Sudanese government. 9,000 people, night after night, 200 at a time, all the way up to Port Sudan and flying out to Israel, one of the extraordinary rescue operations of our time. Those are some of the things you get to do as a diplomat, which live with you forever as one of your most rewarding experiences. So what's the problem? Why are we talking about rebuilding diplomatic capacity? Why should we do it, and what will it cost? Well, why we should do it, I've tried to touch on already, because this is the way we advance our interests in the world. Good ones, humanitarian ones, trade ones, business ones, security ones, without having to resort to military force, but indeed in building cooperation and colleagues. So let me move along with these slides. I'm not great at PowerPoint, so you'll have to forgive me. I don't do it very often, but I'll try and do it. So fixing the crisis. And why is it important? Well, I've talked about this a little bit. We've let our civilian capacity deteriorate. If you look at this chart, and I hope it, if you look at, I can look at it right here. Look at this chart. You'll see in the 1990s this decline. Now, what's curious about this is that in the 1990s, this is when the Soviet Union broke up. So we needed to establish new embassies all through the former countries, that now independent countries of the Soviet Union. Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, etc. And yet, we were doing that with not only no increase in our diplomatic staff, but a decline in our public diplomacy and our U.S. aid staff. And we did that by just stretching people very thin, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so that by the time we got to the early part of 2000, 2001, and we were facing the terrorist threat and all the issues that went with that, we had depleted our diplomatic capacity. Now look at what it meant in terms of how we deploy our resources overseas. In 2002, our military only accounted for 6% of our security assistance programs. By security assistance, I don't mean military hardware. I'm talking about assistance to countries in helping develop their peacekeeping capacity, their development capacity, etc. But look what happens by 2008. 52% of our security assistance program is now being handled by the military. And what's happened is that with the depletion of our diplomatic capacity, we've asked the military to take on roles that are not natural to the military and for which they're not trained and which they really don't want to carry out, but they are taking over where the State Department, where USAID, and where the former USIA is no longer able to carry the burden. So now look at this chart here. Here you have the direct State Department diplomatic staff, and it says it holds steady. But it holds steady during this period of expanding responsibilities. So, for example, we're now heavily involved in international health issues. Why are we involved in international health issues? Obviously, it's a major humanitarian concern of the United States. President Bush inaugurated the President's Emergency Program for AIDS and TB and malaria, and it's had a dramatic effect around the world. But it's not just humanitarian. If there isn't a worldwide health surveillance system, our ability to detect new pandemics, SARS, avian flu, is greatly diminished. So we need health systems around the world that monitor health, that identify outbreaks. That also goes, by the way, for bioterrorism. Any outbreak of anthrax, early reported, allows one to decide whether it's natural or diabolical. So we are now involved in global health in a major way, in education programs, because they are vital to our diplomacy, and I'll come back to that. In globalization, so many things now are global and not confined to bilateral relationships. So our whole trade policy and our trade relationships with countries are changing. And all the threats that we now deal with, terrorism and pandemics, and food safety. These are all transnational problems. You have to have different kinds of skills, different type of monitoring capability. This is all relatively new in the last 20 years. Agriculture, we're initiating a big food security initiative program, but we're also concerned about food safety because we're importing more and more food. climate change. Climate change is going to have a major impact on many of our partners overseas. In Africa, it's predicted that it will unleash tremendous amounts of migration internally to Africa and more migration pressures on Europe, and will probably increase the level of conflict and increase the challenges of development. So we have to get ready for that. We have to figure out what it is you do now to mitigate the problems of climate change. Well, I grew up in AID. That was the first half of my career. We didn't worry about climate change in those days. Now we have to worry about it. And internet outreach. That's the whole changing way in which people communicate for good and for evil. And we have to understand that, and we have to be on top of it. There are other areas. There are the new security threats in which we're heavily involved, like Iraq and Afghanistan, asking whole new skills of civilian diplomats and civilian aid people working in conflict situations, trying to figure out how you bring services to areas that haven't ever had services, like Marja in Afghanistan, but at the same time worried about whether the development behind that, the ability to staff those schools or put books in them or service the wells or all the things that we're doing to win hearts and minds are going to take place. That's a whole different set of skills that we now have to build. So if you look at this chart here, you'll see how many vacancies we now have in this world because we have allowed our capacity to go down. If you look at that chart, you'll see that in the, let me see if I can do this. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's see, there we go. That in overseas posts, we have 10% vacancy rates of generalists, 14, almost 15% of specialists, et cetera, or vacant. And you go down the chart and you can see the number of vacancies. Now, I saw this problem of vacancies in the area that I work on most, which is in Africa. I saw posts in Africa that either didn't have the proper political and economic officers or were assigning senior level jobs to junior level officers because we didn't have the middle and senior level officers to do it. And I can tell you, when it comes to understanding what's happening, what's going on around, you pay a price for that. Now, look at down here, you'll see some of the other new areas. Language designated positions have more than doubled. In fact, 26% of our language designated positions are now vacant. And a majority of our people in the Arabic-speaking world do not speak Arabic. We have allowed our capacity to deal in these areas with the right skills to decline. Now, training slots. You say, well, you know, training is nice, but, you know, it's kind of a luxury. Well, it isn't a luxury. When Colin Powell became Secretary of State, one of the first things he looked at in the State Department was the lack of training. He said, you know, in the military, we train all the time. We're constantly training. We're training in tactics, we're training in strategy. We have officers going to school all the time, war colleges, defense universities, etc. I look at the State Department, he said, and you hardly have enough people to be able to send people into training. You're not going to be ready for the 21st century. And you can see the deficit there in training. It shows up in language skills, area skills, in almost every aspect of our foreign affairs. Now, public diplomacy. What is public diplomacy? Talk about public diplomacy. And it sounds like, well, you're going to go out and tell the American story. We're a great country. We love diversity. We don't dislike Muslims. We believe in free markets, etc. It's much more than that. Those are important things to do, but it's much more than that. For one thing, what public diplomacy involves is outreach to very important parts of society that aren't necessarily in your political dialogue. That means the media. Very important to have relations with the media in other countries. It means relation to the arts community, the music community, the academic community, because they're opinion makers. When I came to Nigeria in 1986, and we then had USIA, which really was our public diplomacy arm, they opened me up to these rich communities in Nigeria that were extremely important in their views of the United States, their impact on views of their government, etc. And we opened up opportunities, and I'm a big fan of some of the things that the Utah Council on Citizens Diplomacy does, academic exchanges, and bringing people here and bringing people overseas. I can't tell you the number of times when I'm overseas working across the board, and the person I'm talking to or working with or negotiating has been on one of these visitor programs to the United States. It just changes their attitude of the United States. They have a familiarity with it that doesn't come any other way. These are terrific programs. They're very well planned. They gear to people's interests. And one of the first people I met in Nigeria had been on a program 25 years earlier. He told me it was one of the great experiences of his life. Now, that kind of program got diminished in the 1990s, and one of the things we have to do is build it back up again. Cultural diplomacy. Now, you think, well, that's a frill. Let me tell you about a wonderful experience we had in South Africa. Right at the beginning of the negotiations, when everybody in South Africa was nervous. After all, this was a major change. They were going from a tightly controlled, minority-dominated apartheid system to an open, democratic, majority rule system with black people that the white people didn't know or trust very well. And it was scary times for everybody. What does it mean? Well, just as this was starting, our USIA brought over the Dance Theater of Harlem. I don't know if you know this group. It's just a magnificent dance group. And they opened the Johannesburg Theater, which had just been redone. And they went out to all the townships and they gave dance lessons. And they had the first major integrated performances in Johannesburg that they had had in many, many years. And the impact on everybody's mood that, you know, this is possible. We can do this. This is going to be a good world, not a bad world ahead of us. It's just one example of the many in which things you don't think about as public diplomacy are extremely important. And that capacity, as you can see from this chart, declined very greatly in recent years. Now, USAID. This is really a sad story. I spent the first half of my career in USAID, and when I joined USAID, it was perhaps the world's leader in thinking about development strategies, development programs, etc. It had expertise in areas. It carried out major programs. What AID became, USAID has become in recent years, is a contracting agency. It contracts out programs in every field. Now, some of the contractors are very good. There's no question about it. A lot of them are retired AID people. But that's different than having an entity that thinks through the changing development problems that we're seeing in the world, problems of poverty that haven't responded, problems of globalization and climate change and how that impacts on development, the balance of trade and aid and all those things. In this process, and I found it hard to believe, I just learned about it recently, USAID abolished its think tank bureau that had done all the thinking and abolished its evaluation unit. It wasn't even in a position to evaluate its own programs. And now we're asking it to do much more. Here you see this small line here, this little line here, is the amount of money that's being managed in these kind of programs with less and less staff. This is not a recipe for success and effectiveness. Now, the Defense Department, as I said, sort of got hit with the impact of this. And Robert Gates, this current Secretary of Defense, made this statement in a speech he gave in Kentucky, which is very unusual for a defense secretary, is saying, look, what I need most is more capacity in state and AID. And you can read it for yourself. I won't just read it. But the point is that he has come out strongly to say that he can't carry out his mission in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, or wherever else our security areas are threatened without rebuilding this capacity. Now, there's a study done by the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Stimson Center in Washington that said, what do we need? What does it cost to do this right? Well, here's what it costs. It costs $3.3 billion. It's not cheap. But remember, we're only spending now 1% of our budget on these things. That means getting the right number of people. It means we need to build up 4,700 new positions in these various agencies. Now, part of it is core diplomacy. 1,000, a little over 1,000 new diplomatic staff. And you'll see later, a lot of this goes into language training, skills training, to meet the growing requirements. Staff cost, $500 million, not cheap. Fee to appropriated consular staff. Did you know that our consular staff is paid for by the fees that visa applicants pay to the government? And it can't expand beyond the amount that they can collect for visas and various immigration data. The result is that the consular staff does not grow, even though we have all the terrorism threats and all the problems of people getting visas, et cetera. Our recommendation is we've got to go beyond that. We've got to fund a decent-sized consular staff because they're the ones who take care of Americans overseas and who man the whole visa and immigration process overseas. What do we got here? Okay. And now, diplomatic emergencies, humanitarian emergencies. We have diplomatic emergencies are the attacks on embassies, the need to evacuate people. It happens a lot. In fact, one of the reasons that our European command became so interested in Africa is they kept having to go down and evacuate diplomats out of Liberia and Somalia, et cetera. And they said, there's something going on down there that we need to know more about. But humanitarian emergencies, of course, Haiti, we've all seen in the news, and Chile and elsewhere. These are huge, and $100 million of new staff and capability is minor. I ran the refugee program for the State Department for 3 years. There are approximately 30 million people who get help through various refugee and internally displaced programs around the world. It's a major, major requirement, and it has enormous political implications because refugees aren't just women and children in refugee camps. It's also people fleeing political oppression who may want to go back and fight for their country. So taking care of those people and responding to it becomes a major American diplomatic objective. Now, I talked about training. We need more staff. You have to have staff in order to be able to send people on training because otherwise you're just pulling them out of vital jobs. You need what's called the training float. We don't have it in the State Department or USAID, not nearly enough. So we don't put people in long-term language training. We don't put it in long-term economics training nearly as much. You have to increase the staff to get to a float. And what is the cost? Well, not cheap, $300 million. Now, public diplomacy, I've talked about the tremendous need in public diplomacy. You can see here the staff costs, the dollar costs, the program costs. Well, what does a program cost mean? It means increasing the number of academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, but it also means opening or reopening a lot of the cultural posts we used to have that we closed in the 1990s. We used to have libraries. We used to have USIA libraries all around the country at various countries we were in. And you'd be surprised at what went on in those libraries. Young people who couldn't find places to study in their own countries would come and study in the American libraries. They'd make use of the books, but they'd also make use of a safe place to study and pass exams. I know a general who used to come there to write his PhD dissertation in Nigeria. And then they are exposed to American books, American films, etc. I have never seen, with rare exception anyway, anyone speak negatively about American cultural outposts and libraries, but we've closed them in so many places. And what this proposes is we get back to that. Now, USAID, I've talked about USAID, what it's changed. You have to rebuild this whole agency. You have to increase the staff, and again, it's nothing comes free. Savings from PSC reductions. Those are all those contracts that we now use in place of having people who work for the agency. This proposes you build back up the capacity of the development agency itself. Now, stabilization capacity, this deals with the problems of places in conflict, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, elsewhere, where we're talking about building back these societies, creating services in places they've never been, working on peace agreements, trying to bring stabilization out of chaos, because out of chaos comes criminality, comes drug trafficking, comes terrorism. Now, security assistance. What we're talking about here is building up the capacity to be able to take back from the Pentagon some of the key security programs and put them under political control. That doesn't mean that they're all carried out by the State Department, but let me give you an example of the importance of political direction to security programs. Some years ago, our European command, rightly and correctly, said that there is a potential security problem in West Africa in what they call the ungoverned space of the Sahel, that space between North Africa and the Sahel, and needed to build up the capacity of those governments to control their borders, to control their own territory. The problem was there was no political direction to the program. So suddenly we were helping a government we shouldn't have been helping in Chad. We were helping a government in Mauritania that soon was going to be overthrown because it was so unpopular. And when I talked to the general in charge of the program and I said, couldn't you use political oversight? He said, I'd love it if I had it, but there's no one in the department giving me political oversight. Well, that's changing. We're trying to move that program back into a politically directed and coordinated program, and the Pentagon's happier for it, but you need capacity to do that. The $3.3 billion represents an increase over what the baseline has been for the increases in staff. And I won't bother you and take your time with all these details, but here you have what the State Department is now beginning to do, because this has been recognized not only by the last administration, but by this administration. And what you're seeing is a 5-year plan to rebuild America's diplomatic capacity. You can see up there the training capacity, the float that I talked, another 300 positions, training capacity, and eventually to get a 25% increase in basic core diplomacy. Foreign service hiring, unprecedented hiring. Normally we hire 500 civil service, 500 foreign service. Now the State Department will have hired nearly 1,400, triple the normal amount. All of you thinking of going into the State Department, this is good news. 766 generalists, 589 specialists, etc. This is the beginning of rebuilding our diplomatic capacity. And here's where these new areas are going: into democracy, good governance, global security, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, education, humanitarian, all these areas, new areas, tough areas to deal with, and building up that capacity. But building up the capacity in itself doesn't solve the problem overnight. You can bring in a lot of people, but it will take years before those people are trained and move up the ladder to assume positions of major responsibility. So we're running behind, and we're going to be running behind for a long time. But what I'm pleased about is that there seems to be a commitment now in the administration, in the Congress, both parties, bipartisan agreement that we need to rebuild that capacity. We're really flying blind without it. And I'm not just making a parochial demand for areas in which my career has gone. I think, as you know from Secretary Gates' comment, that without that, we can't do the things we want to do. Let me just give you another example. Recently, you all read about the Christmas Day bomber, Abdul Muttalib from Nigeria. If you ask the experts on Nigeria, our own embassy and other people, do you think there are Al-Qaeda cells in northern Nigeria? I can tell you that the real answer is we don't know. We don't have anybody who speaks Hausa. We don't have any consulate anymore in the north. We did when I was there. We don't have a cultural center in the north. We don't even travel very much in the north of Nigeria. So we may have an idea of whether it's a serious problem in northern Nigeria, but we don't really know. If you ask how serious is the problem in Mombasa, Kenya, a hotbed of potential terrorist activity, the answer was we don't know, because we don't have any presence in Mombasa, Kenya, although it's one of the most important cities in the country. So we're flying blind in a lot of places. And when you fly blind, you make mistakes. You either overreact, you say, well, Nigeria must be a hotbed of Islamic extremism. It isn't, actually. And then you take steps that only make the Nigerians angry. Or you underestimate the problem. You don't reach out to Islamic leaders in northern Nigeria to see just what the issues really are. So without the capacity to do that, and I can multiply that around the world, we're flying blind in many cases. And when you fly blind, you make mistakes. You make bad judgments. I was very fortunate when I was in South Africa. I had 3 consulates around the country, one in Johannesburg, one in Durban, one in Cape Town. I had a mines officer, a labor officer, a top-notch political team, an economic team, etc. They were all over the country, and they weren't all State Department people. Our agricultural attaché was out selling wheat and corn, which was wonderful, but he was also finding out what farmers were thinking about the change, black farmers, white farmers, etc. And because of that outreach, because we had people all over the country, we could make judgments. They were risky judgments. Was there going to be a coup in South Africa? Would the military move to stop the change? That would have changed the way we were moving and the way we were encouraging the South Africans to move. Was there going to be a civil war in KwaZulu-Natal between Buthelezzi's Inkatha people and the ANC after independence, like there was in Zimbabwe? We didn't think so, and went right down to the wire. But we had people working day and night on that problem in both places. At the same time, or a few years later, my colleagues in Nigeria had no consulates in the Delta region, which is where all the oil is and where there's an insurgency, nothing in the north of Nigeria. And I said, how do you guys operate? And they said, we guess. So we're flying blind in too many places, and we pay a price for it. I think we can do a lot better. I think we are building up that capability, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take money, and it's going to take people like you. Because we need people, almost all of you have gone out or are going out to have international experience. You're learning languages. We're desperate for people who can speak languages like Arabic, Chinese, etc. Or at least we're going to get the money to train people to do so, to go out, to reach out, to learn, to represent your country, to bring to bear the totality of American ideals and resources on situations that can build a more cooperative world. That's what this is all about, and I think we're on track for the first time in a long time. I think we're on track. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer questions. I think we have some more time, Corey. Okay, please let me answer any questions. Gentleman way in the back. Oh, wait a minute! You're going to get a microphone.
Thank you. So what you're proposing is to have, as far as the consulates and embassies that you're talking about, as far as handing out passports and visas and whatever. So you think that should be funded by the government, and the cost shouldn't be on the people applying for those visas and passports?
What we're saying is it shouldn't be wholly. You ought to figure out how many people you need and not say, well, we can't raise that much money in visa fees, so we'll hold it back. And then you supplement the visa fees with enough additional money to have the right number of people. To make one part of your government tied to, and we've raised those fees if you're following it, green card fees and visa fees have gone up dramatically. Applications for citizenship have gone up dramatically. But it's not funding the total need. So it's not to do away with that system, but not to let that be the driving force of how many people you have on the ground able to do this. Other questions? Yes, gentleman right there.
So I'm from Brazil, and we have a lot of anti-Americanism there, as well as in Latin America in general. So in your opinion, I know that's a lot of propaganda against the United States, but in your opinion, another factor that influenced this is this lack of cultural diplomacy, like United States not doing enough to, you don't have enough diplomacy to improve your image. Do you think that's?
Well, I think it's very important. Look, there's always going to be a certain degree of anti-Americanism. If you're big, you excite that kind of thing, and that's livable, but up to a point. But a lot of it is the feeling that the United States doesn't care, or not really understanding the complexity of the United States. You may disagree with American foreign policy in X and Y. It doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. is a bad country. There's much more to it than that particular policy, and that is the outreach. That is the reaching out to a wide variety of people, cultural diplomacy, working with the media, working with academics, having exchanges, getting people to know each other. It sounds corny, but it really does make a big difference. And then, I don't expect people to love the United States or agree with everything we do, but I do hope that we get people to appreciate the United States, the good and the problems they have problems with, but to understand this isn't a bad country. We're not really, with all due respect, we're not really out to conquer a lot of countries. And it makes a difference if you reach out and build that kind of understanding. And so, yeah, it takes outreach. It takes people out there. It takes people who fall in love with Brazil and want to interact with it, quite seriously, and people who come to the United States and understand it's not just Washington and New York. It's Salt Lake City. It's San Diego. It's Portland, Oregon, and it's a very rich country society that America is. It makes a difference. Yes, Laura.
I wonder if you could touch upon the complexity of actually the budget process. There are a lot of roadblocks to having Congress appropriate these funds. What are the ways that you see that this can be advocated for successfully, and do you think that we will indeed be able to reach the goals that you've set?
It is a complicated process. I think the first process is internal in the departments itself, because you have competing interests. We've spent an awful lot of our diplomatic money in recent years on securing our embassies. It's just an enormous amount of money because of terrorism. We're building these security fortresses. I have a lot of problems with it, but I understand it. But it's taken a lot of money. And that seems to get a lot of priority because nobody wants to see an American embassy blown up, et cetera. But then you have to decide within the departments and within AID, okay, how much are we going to go for this, for new personnel rather than something else? Then you have to convince the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and the President. It's got to be important enough. Now, I'll tell you what happened. Colin Powell came in, and he was one of, I'll be honest, not every Secretary of State pays attention to the institution. Okay, they're going to be there 3 years, 4 years. They're not going to be there very long. They're not going to build up the next 10 years. They got diplomacy on their mind. They got to solve the Middle East problems, et cetera. They don't pay attention to it. Some secretaries say, wait a minute, if this institution is so weak, part of my responsibility is to see that it's built up. And we've had secretaries like that. One was Colin Powell. He saw the problem. He saw it as a priority. He had the support of the president, and they started. But then the Iraq War came. Other things got on the agenda, so that first spurt sort of got flattened off, and we weren't getting the support to sustain it. And that's one of the reasons the study was done, and then a new administration comes in and says, we have to do more diplomacy and do more. And that has given it a lot of political support. Now, in the Congress, in the last 2 years, support has been pretty good. There is a recognition in the Congress. Maybe it's a reaction to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, but there is a feeling, yeah, this really is, if we're going to be engaged in all these problems, we really have to rebuild that capacity. There's a great deal of unhappiness in the Congress with the foreign aid program, and they realize that we don't have the skills anymore to put it together and do it in the right way. Hillary Clinton has said she wants to make diplomacy and development equal pillars. That means she's got to have a capacity to do it, and quite frankly, the department doesn't have that capacity. So right now, the sport is pretty good, but I tell you, it's going to get tougher because we're facing all these budget problems now. I'd be surprised if we made all these 5-year goals. I'd be happy. No, I won't be happy, but I'll be pleased if we make half to 2/3. Because I feel the pressure is going to come back on the foreign affairs areas because of all our budgets. But getting that impetus started now, getting strong support from the Secretary, it's the Secretary who has to carry much of the battle. She has to, in this case, Hillary Clinton, she has to be the one who argues with OMB. It's not good enough for anybody else to do it. She has to be going up to the Hill, and when they ask her about Afghanistan and Iraq and Israel and all the rest, and she says, but, Congressman, one of my priorities is getting these things. If she doesn't say that, it's gone. And that's why the involvement at the top level is so important. Right now, we've got it. She's very committed to it. And I hope she continues it. But it's going to get tougher. It's going to get tougher. And there's a lot of argument going out about the foreign aid program, where it should be. Should it be in the State Department? Should it be outside the State Department? The NSC is running one study. State Department's running another study. That tells you there's a lot of rivalry going on. So we haven't yet seen that bureaucratic solution, and that could create problems for bringing it all together. Yes, Professor.
I hear a lot of discussion these days about the Chinese and their diplomatic successes, in particular a different kind of model where their diplomats stay in country, they learn the language, they in many respects become dual citizens, that they spend an awful lot of time in the country instead of the typical 2 years, and it has increased their soft power in the world to an incredible amount. And I'm curious, as we build our capacity in numbers, is there also a discussion about changing how we go about doing diplomacy?
Well, the Chinese I like to think of them as formidable competitors, politically and economically. Not strategic threats, but competitors. They have a very good sense of how to mix politics and economics. Their outreach is not just for oil and natural resources, like a lot of people say. It's for having 40 African votes in the UN on their side, in the Human Rights Committee and the WTO. They mix their aid and their commercial interests in a way we can't do. They have more high-level visits to places like Africa and Latin America than we do, and they'll do more in 1 year than we'll do in 5. We think it's wonderful when the president goes once in 4 years. Chinese presidents in Africa every other year. So they're formidable competitors. They're opening up Confucian language centers like our USIA centers used to be. They're bringing thousands of people into China. So yeah, they're formidable. They're also running into problems. They thought because they were, quote, third world, they wouldn't run into security problems. But their people got attacked in the Niger Delta. Their workers got killed in Ethiopia. And they're saying, ooh, maybe there is something to this stability and governance set of issues. So they're not perfect, but they're telling us we've got to respond. Now, one of the things to get at this is there are people in the State Department thinking of setting up one-person posts in places that are sort of far out and obscure. And we got to deal with the security people who say it's not safe. And I have a view of this. I think you ask for volunteers to take these posts because they are risky. But you establish one-person posts up in northern Nigeria, up in Mombasa, and up in other places, and you get people out there. And the language, I mean, we are so far behind in the language. We've got to build that up much more. So yeah, I think the Chinese are sending us a message. And they're not the only ones. The Indians, the Brazilians, et cetera, are becoming much more active in these parts of the world. And they're willing to spend money on it. and be active. Yes, Jennifer.
How would you argue against the criticism of propaganda, looking at public diplomacy as a form of propaganda?
Yeah. Well, one man's public diplomacy is another person's propaganda. Look, one thing I found when I went overseas, much to my surprise, was that in a lot of places, the American ambassador's speeches get reprinted in the newspapers. My speeches in the U.S. do not get reprinted in the newspapers, but in there, and that gives you a tremendous platform if you know how to use it, and you can waste it. You can waste it easily. But what it tells you is that people want to know what the United States is thinking. They really do want to know, and if you explain why the U.S. is taking particular positions and what we're about, it matters. Now, you have to be convincing. You can't be just fluff. You have to be honest. And you have to have a reason to give a speech. I think people waste their time by giving speeches when they don't have anything to say. But when you reach out to people in exchanges, you bring people here, and you know that well from bringing people here, you're letting them see America and make judgments. They won't all come back saying America is great and glorious, because they don't. They see the problems. But they come back and they say, it's a more interesting society than we thought. It's very open, and there's a lot of diversity of opinion in the United States. Is that propaganda? You can call it that. But I think public diplomacy is a way of building a much better knowledge base for people to deal with each other. It cuts through a lot of the ice. I'll give you, another story. It happens to be military exchanges, which, by the way, are very, very valuable. I was traveling through Nigeria. When I was in Nigeria, it was a military government. So all the governors of all the states were military men. And I got to one state, and people told me this guy is a hard guy. He's a nasty guy. He doesn't like diplomats, et cetera. I said, okay, but I'm going to go call on everybody. And it just happened that day that we had a bluegrass group coming through Nigeria, bluegrass music, and they were playing in that state that night. So I went to the performance. Governor was there, and to everybody's amazement, especially his staff, he's sitting there tapping his foot. He's just having a grand time. So next day I said, gee, you seem to like bluegrass. He said, I had a posting at Fort Leavenworth, and I got a car and I drove all around that part of America, and all I heard every day on the radio was bluegrass music. I came to love it. And it just changed the atmosphere. And we could talk about things. It sounds funny and corny, but in fact, those things make a difference. They just change. That was a part of America he loved. So then I could, I'm the American ambassador and I got my checkpoints. But it changed the atmosphere, and you can multiply that a lot of times, and it pays. Doesn't mean that that means that everybody's going to do everything you want, but it does change the atmosphere in which you operate. All right. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it, and I wish you all good luck. I don't know what to do with this, but